welcome. I will only be 3 minutes. I have one paragraph. I would like to welcome you all. It is especially pleasing to see alumni, to see people from philosophy and communication and rhetorical studies, from theology, to welcome the deans from the college. I can't remember when last we drew people from so many different places, and it's really very, very heartening and pleasing to see such a big crowd. Welcome Dr. Giorgi back to Duquesne after 25 years? 26 years. Last night, Dean Swindell provided a very nice introduction and background, historical background. We recorded the interview that we did last night, so I won't go over the history and the important and pioneering role that Dr. Giorgi played at this university and for the psychology department in particular. You can look that up. It's in the Silverman Center, and certainly in all of the records, Father Smith's book about the department, it is well documented. For me, I just wanted to welcome Dr. Giorgi formally. I wanted to say that as the current chair, that I am very aware that the structure of inheritance is such that we live in the future of those whom we succeed, that we lived in the time they dreamed and imagined. And to the extent that there's a specific responsibility that accrues from this recognition, that this responsibility issues in a response, it is in the response of a project towards a not yet. And lest we forget, the very, very word project is to throw forward, like a projectile, a probe, a forward, and a yasere, a throwing, a project that throws into a future with a profound recognition of where we come from, so that this here then today, this here then is as much about memory as it is about promise. It's as much about a past as it is about a future. It's as much about a teaching as it is about a learning. It's as much about a thank you as it is about a please. It's as much about a gift as it is about a giving. As much about your giving, Dr. Giorgi, as it is about your gift.
Thank you.
And so we welcome you. We hope you enjoy your time with us, and we are very honored to have you with us.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Lobscher for instigating this program, which I understand is going back to the early faculty to see how it all began. And I think it's important because the psychology department here was a unique experiment that we tried, partially in naivete, partially out of a desire to do something we thought that was really worthwhile. And how that will progress is up to you rather than us. But I also would like to remember the real beginners of this, because most are not with us anymore. And if those who are still with us, like Tony, will have his say and should have his say. But first and foremost, I'd like to remember Father Henry Koren. He was a Dutchman who came from Holland, emigrated here, I think in the early 50s. And he was a real dynamo. He was a philosopher, not a psychologist, but he's the one that transformed the philosophy department from a scholastic department into a phenomenological one. And then he revivified the Duquesne University Press. There was a press, but it was rather dormant at the time. And it was Henry Koren who really renovated it and made it phenomenological so that it became a sort of key phenomenological outlet. The second person I want to remember is Father Adrian von Kamm, also a Holy Ghost father. He emigrated to the States a few years after Henry Corin, but he was a psychologist, and he had a certain vision. He's the one that really had the vision for the psychology department, that we should do one thing and do it well. And since Carnegie Mellon was sort of computer-oriented, and Pitt was animal-oriented, he said we should be human-oriented based upon a phenomenological perspective. And so he's the one that did a lot of the work and got the approval from the administration to have a PhD program, and it was approved precisely because we showed how different we were from Pitt and Carnegie Mellon. The other person I have to recognize is Father Ed Hogan at the time, but later Dr. Hogan. We were classmates at Fordham University. He was a Holy Ghost father, getting a degree the same time I was. And he's the one who introduced me to von Kamm. I got a letter from him one day, and he said, there's a young Dutch priest out here who's making the same kind of critique of psychology you used to make. You ought to meet him sometime. And so I did. I met von Kamm, and he was really inspirational and really the one responsible for the vision of the department. And then I'd just like to mention some of the other faculty who are no longer with us. I hope I remember them all. Of course, Ralph von Eckertsberg, who brought a social dimension, Dick Knowles, who had a developmental dimension, Chuck Mays, who was a clinical, Alice Wagstaff, who was also clinical, Father Dave Smith was psychoanalytic in orientation. They've all passed on, but they've all made their contributions to the department as well. So I want to acknowledge them. Now, what I'm going to present today is sort of carrying out a bit the vision we had when we founded the department. The vision was that with existential phenomenology, we could revitalize and transform psychology. And you would take the thought of one of the major philosophers, see what insights they had about human beings, and then try to see how the psychology would flow from those insights. So I'm going to use Husserl as my philosopher today, but I could have used, several others, but I'll use Husserl. And when I talk about the beginnings of the department, I kind of say we and us, but that's part of the faculty. I am a non-clinician. I'm a research psychologist. I'm a theoretical psychologist. So I speak about it the way I would envision, and some of the other faculty who are not clinical. If you want the clinical history, you have to go to Tony or somebody else who would give you that history. So I know most of the students today are clinical, so I want to tell you this is a non-clinical perspective on psychology, and there is one, and it can be implemented. So let me start. If in the 1950s, some of us found psychology to be lacking, what was wrong with it? And how would one go about correcting it? What was holding back its vigorous development? Why was our understanding of the human person not advancing the way that our knowledge of nature was progressing? Well, for one thing, the human person was not so much the theme of the research psychologist of that era as an animal was. And if a human was thematized, it was not the essential human that was studied so much as the human phenomena with primarily sensorial and physiological manifestations. Why did this state of affairs exist? Because psychology strove to become a natural science, and the phenomena that were studied had to show characteristics that were similar to nature, and they had to have an empirical basis. Whether or not such an approach clarified human phenomena was not as important as psychology's scientific status. More important than the clarification of human phenomena was psychology's determination to be a natural science, although mainstream psychologists honestly believed they were doing both. And I can tell you that my training, I went to a research program, was far more important to be scientific than psychological, almost. A critical question that was rarely raised is, did psychology have to be a natural science? Even in that era, there was awareness of the Geist und Wissenschaft tradition in Germany, which actually had a certain dominance during the years of the Weimar Republic. But the American intellectual scientific culture did not look upon that tradition with favor. The other rarely raised question that the department had to consider was, should psychology leave the realm of science altogether? Somehow that did not seem right either. It could be a Wissenschaft, that which meant an organized body of knowledge in the sense of the German tradition, and not a commitment to the methods and procedures of the physical sciences. Moreover, if one concentrated on specifically human characteristics, one could have a human science. Logically, such a distinction made sense, but sociologically and politically, it was a challenge to implement. We were pretty much on our own. However, I'm sure that the implementation would be even more difficult today with APA's attempt to make psychology a STEM science, that is, a science that emphasizes natural science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. If you take those four terms and think of a human person you want to understand, I find a big discrepancy. But anyway, that's what APA wants to do. But what difference could the idea of a human science, the interpretation that the department adopted, make for psychology? It would prioritize the philosophical anthropology of being human in a distinctively personal sense, and not humans' commonalities with nature. But of course, in the psychological world, differences existed here as well. For many psychologists, the study of humans did not mean that one had to leave the realm of nature. Humans were more complex, perhaps, but just as natural as a thing. So they adopted the philosophical view known as naturalism. Here's what Ruhn's Dictionary of Philosophy says about naturalism. It's a long entry, so I'll just read some excerpts. Naturalism, challenging the cogency of cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments, holds that the universe requires no supernatural cause and government, but is self-existent, self-explanatory, self-operating, and self-directing. That the world process is not teleological and anthropocentric, but purposeless, deterministic, and only incidentally productive of man. That's the naturalistic viewpoint. Consequently, if one followed naturalistic assumptions, no change in perspective was required to study humans. And that is the path that mainstream psychology follows. However, in the world at large, other views and other philosophies existed. For those of us for whom the naturalistic perspective was not convincing, a different perspective was needed, and that is where existential phenomenological philosophy comes in. It was thriving in post-World War II Europe of that time. We turned to it because we recognized that what was required was a non-naturalistic philosophical anthropology. We needed a philosophy that would explicitly acknowledge uniquely human characteristics and methods for exploring such characteristics. We interpreted our task to be one in which we were to be as faithful to persons as natural science was to nature. Natural scientific psychology was more interested in being scientific, and so it imitated the methods and procedures of the natural sciences, even though it meant a reductionistic understanding of what it meant to be human. In other words, it was more interested in being scientific than in being faithful to the human person. Mainstream psychology found the methods and perspective they wanted to use to be already in existence, and all they had to do was to adopt them or else modify them slightly. But it also meant that they chose phenomena that could fit into the pre-existing methods. Nobody said this more precisely than Sigmund Koch. Sigmund Koch was given a big grant by the Ford Foundation to study the development of a science, and since psychology was young, he chose psychology, and there are 6 volumes in that study, and 1 volume he writes a summary of what he found. Among the things that he found, he said, psychology was unique in the extent to which institutionalization preceded its content, and its methods preceded its problems. Thus, despite psychology's belief that it was empirical, its ambition to be a natural science was an ideological commitment that was forced upon its subject matter. Its desire to be a natural science actually preceded an examination of its subject matter. By adopting and imitating the pre-existing natural scientific methods and criteria, its methods preceded its problems. Our aim was the reverse. We desired first to remain faithful to human reality in all its complexity, and our task was to invent concepts, procedures, and research methods that would not reduce our understanding of what it meant to be human. So here was the contrast we faced in the beginnings in 1962 when we first started the department. Mainstream psychology believed that it had a clear conception of the kind of science that psychology should be, and it was armed with methods and criteria concerning the sense of a good natural science. So when it approached the subject matter, consciousness, behavior, or experience, it made sure that it met the pre-existing criteria of science. Most practitioners did not, at least initially, realize the distorting effect that such an approach had on its subject matter. For example, the behaviorists who studied animals under conditions so restrictive that their normal behavior in an actual friendly environment was never observed. Of course, many traditional psychologists did not believe that there was a distorting effect. We, on the other hand, wanted to function within the context of a human science, and our goal was to be faithful to a robust understanding of being human, and we realized that we would have to invent methods, procedures, and criteria that would satisfy our goals. We realized that the kind of science we were seeking did not as yet exist. So we tried to bring it about into existence. A certain equality had to be posited between the researcher and the research participant, the only difference being the role that each played. Whatever one wanted to say about the researcher had to be said about the participant in terms of human characteristics and possibilities. We were too conscious of the behaviorist who ignored the consciousness of its participants even while they used their own consciousness to study the behavior of others. In our view, existential phenomenological philosophy offered us such an option, and so we proceeded to work out that project. Neither humanness nor science should be distorted in such a program, but a clear sense of humanness or personhood was not there at the beginning, nor was a thorough understanding of human science initially present. To be sure, there were guiding ideas, but these were meant to be developed and clarified as we progressed. We were to discover our science as we conducted studies on specific human phenomena. Now, I'd like to indicate the difference that a phenomenologically based human science of psychology can make by taking one of the most difficult issues for empiricists, the givenness of irreal phenomena. I shall use Husserl to demonstrate this point, but I could have used any one of the big four. When Heidegger distinguishes between being, capital B, from being, small b, he is introducing the irreal. As we know, Sartre distinguished between being and nothingness. And for him, consciousness is a nothingness, but it is also precisely nothingness which reveals being. And for Merleau-Ponty, the visible is dependent upon and supported by the invisible. In encountering phenomena, phenomenologists always find some sense of the irreal, and that dimension is always important for understanding the phenomena as experienced by humans. But I use Husserl because he confronts the issue directly and he contrasts his position with that of the empiricists. So the next section is the presence of non-naturalistic phenomena, the irreal. So if you want to uphold the philosophical perspective that humans, while partially natural, also have dimensions that are non-natural, where do we turn? I want to turn to the most obvious and yet the most difficult phenomenon for non-supporters of our approach to embrace: the presence of irreal phenomena or irreal dimensions of real phenomena. Until psychology tackles this issue, it will not make significant headway in understanding human psychological phenomena. Before pointing to examples of such phenomena, I want to speak to the biggest stumbling block to the acknowledgement of the irreal: empiricism. In the West, there is only one philosophy of science that is taken seriously, and that's empiricism. Sometimes it's presented as a kind of liberal logical empiricism, and sometimes it's presented as a more strict positivism, but always some form of empiricism is the basis of science. If you've been trained in psychology in the 20th or early part of the 21st century, whether you know it or not, you're an empiricist. Now, empiricism is not all bad, but it is more limited than many empiricists are willing to admit. And it is not so much that phenomenological philosophy is against empiricism, but it is more comprehensive than it. In fact, Husserl in Ideas 1 praises empiricism. He writes, "As we must acknowledge, empiricistic naturalism springs from the most praiseworthy motives. In contrast to all idols," obvious reference to Francis Bacon, "to the powers of tradition and superstition, of crude and refined prejudices of every sort, it is a radicalism of cognitive practice that aims at enforcing the right of autonomous reasoning as the sole authority on questions of truth." End of quote. So far, Husserl has no quarrel with empiricism. He agrees with its goals. But he questions whether empiricism has carried out its project sufficiently accurately. He continues as follows: "But to judge rationally or scientifically about things signifies to conform to the things themselves," the famous phenomenological slogan, "or to go from words and opinions back to the things themselves, to consult them in their self-givenness and set aside all prejudices alien to them. Only another mode of expression for just this, so the empiricist believes, is that all science must proceed from experience, must ground its immediate cognition on immediate experience. The empiricist, therefore, takes genuine science and experiential science to be identical." End of quote. For Husserl, it is that identification that limits empiricism. He goes on to show just how empiricism is limited. Quote, "The essential fault in empiricistic argumentation consists of identifying or confusing the fundamental demand for a return to the things themselves with the demand for legitimation of all cognition by experience. With his comprehensible naturalistic constriction of the limits bounding cognizable things, the empiricist simply takes experience to be the only act that is presentive of things themselves. But things are not simply mere things belonging to nature, nor is actuality in the usual sense simply all of actuality, and that originarily presentive act, which we call experience in the natural sciences, relates only to actuality in nature. To make identification here and treat them as supposed truisms is blindly to push aside differences which can be given with the clearest insight. So what other types of givens that might not fall under the empiricist claims? Husserl spoke more positively about the phenomenological perspective when he wrote, quote, "Immediate seeing, not merely sensuous, experiential seeing, but seeing in the universal sense as an originally presentive consciousness of any kind, is the ultimate legitimizing source of all rational assertions. This source has its legitimizing function only because, and to the extent that, it is an originally presentive source." End of quote. Of course, what I just said is a paraphrase of Husserl's principle of all principles. Husserl's point is that there can be non-physical objects that can be given to consciousness. Because he admitted that such acts were possible, Husserl, ironically, stated that he was the true positivist. He admitted that this was a new mode of seeing, but maintained that it was as legitimate as experiential seeing. He then wrote the sentence that is absolutely key for being able to found psychology as a human science. I quote, "For experience, we therefore substitute something more universal, intuition. And by so doing, we reject the identification of science taken universally with experiential science. In other words, the true function of consciousness is to intuit, to make things, events, phenomena present. Experience is a subcategory of intuition. Experience presents us with real things, and for Husserl, the real is anything that exists in space, time, and regulated by causality. But the real does not exhaust the types of presences that can be given to consciousness. Irreal objects, like ideas and numbers, and even quasi-real objects, like imaginary figures, can become present to consciousness. And if such objects can present themselves to human consciousness, and psychology is the science of consciousness, isn't it incumbent upon psychology to comprehend how they are encountered and what role they play in a person's life? I will even go out on the limb and declare that the irreal and the quasi-real are far more interesting for psychology than the real. Mm-hmm. After all, what are the phenomena that incite psychological interest? A quick scanning of any textbook will show topics such as illusions, delusions, false memories, pathologies, imaginary objects, fantasies, motives, dreams, phantom limbs, and so on. All of these phenomena contain irreal or quasi-real characteristics. Perhaps the real objects are the norms against which these phenomena are to be judged, but still, we have to understand why consciousness can intuit irreal or quasi-real phenomena. But empiricists do not accept that these irreal phenomena are directly intuited. For empiricists, they are not a legitimate datum. Rather, empiricists often claim that the irreal objects are created by consciousness. For years, psychologists have made that claim because a type of real object is not present to anchor the experience, but since something is experienced, then it must have been produced by consciousness itself. In other words, the default position is that since no sensorial presence is given, the experienced object must have been produced by consciousness, but not for Husserl. An irreal object is given just as much as a sensorial object is given, and it can be intuited and described. I can reflect on and think about the idea of justice without any sensorial presence necessarily being there. For phenomenologists, there is direct evidence for such presentations. But empiricists always come up with some kind of theory to try to prove that the irreal is somehow the result of earlier real encounters, or in some other way are dependent upon the real. What phenomenologists call direct evidence is not accepted by empiricists. But we must be careful here. So far, I've been speaking from the perspective of the natural attitude. And so the distinction between real and irreal holds. If we recall that phenomenologists must function within the phenomenological reduction, then the existential positing of the given is withheld. So what are given are considered to be presences rather than existences. With irreal presences, we have the seemingly paradoxical situation where lack of realness is considered a presence, but in this case, the irreality is withheld. But we still have a meaningful object to be analyzed. In a sense, the reduction is a great equalizer. We analyze presences regardless of their existential status. Thus, one can analyze a veridical perception and an illusion and see what meanings emerge from such analyses insofar as they are positive presences. This approach is different from a reality-based one where illusions are understood to be negative and thus analyzed usually pejoratively. But if we come back to the natural attitude, the classic instance of a dispute between real and irreal is the result of the Vertsburg School. The Vertsburg School stands out in the history of psychology because its results were controversial and never resolved. Between 1900 and about 1910, the psychologists at Vertsburg studied the processes of thinking by means of experiments that involved introspections concerning the solution of problems with which participants were presented. During the course of the descriptions of how the problems were solved, some participants described the appearance of imageless thoughts. Sometimes images were also present, but they avowed that some non-sensory content was also present. This triggered off some 24 experiments trying to replicate the findings up until the early 1920s. And their results were also contradictory. Some supported imageless thought, and some did not find it. The psychologist Angel was against the notion and called it a logical abstraction, and Titchener was against it because he thought that images were carriers of meaning, and so no new element had to be posited to account for meanings. Titchener also complained that the observers were not careful enough in their observations and descriptions. Wundt chimed in and criticized the very nature of the experiments, saying that truly rigorous introspective procedures were not followed. Still, some dozen others did find that their participants reported imageless contents while solving problems. Throughout this controversy, no one mentioned the Husserlian conviction that the intuition of non-sensorial objects was possible. One could almost see the positive results of the Vertsburg School as confirmation of Husserl's idea. Yet, I have never seen that idea expressed in any literature on this topic. But it seems to me to be an obvious conclusion. But I still do not see today's empiricists any more convinced than those who objected to the findings in the early part of the 20th century. The major stance is there cannot be an intuition of a non-sensorial given. That means presence to one. My contention is that in order for psychology to develop into a mature science of humans, it must break away from empirical philosophy and naturalism as the basis for its science. One reason is because empiricism's mode of dealing with the irreal is inadequate. In my view, phenomenological philosophy comprehends such phenomena in a better way. Note, I'm not saying that empiricists do not deal with such irreal phenomena. They do indeed recognize them, but they do not admit that they can be directly intuited and substitute for the lack of direct intuition various cumbersome theories to account for their presence. These alternative theoretical explanations hinder a proper understanding of the irreal and how to cope with them. Phenomenologists convert their status to presences and then try to understand them positively. But will such an argument convince empiricists? I doubt it, because empiricists do not trust subjectivity. They seem to believe that objectivity means the removal of subjectivity from an encounter in order to perceive something as it really is. But if all subjectivity is removed, how can anyone know what the objective thing is? It would require at least an observer to become aware of the given. In contrast, phenomenologists argue that objectivity is an achievement of subjectivity, not a removal of it. The differences between phenomenologists and empiricists regarding the irreal are a stumbling block to a unitary perspective in psychology. If psychology is to become a coherent science, this difference has to be made explicit and thoroughly debated. The next section is real objects and the irreal. One may concede that perhaps empiricism misses irreal objects, but when it comes to dealing with real objects and their perception, surely empiricism is on the right track. Before we make that assertion, however, we have to look at the whole context. As we know, Husserl introduced the notion of the life world, and he pointed out its irrevocable foundational role for all of humankind's subsequent activities. He was especially concerned with the meaning of modern science and how the objects of modern science were constructed on the basis of everyday phenomena, but also transformative of them. And then he noted that the transformed objects were substituted for the phenomena of everyday life. He stated, quote, "Immediately with Galileo begins the surreptitious substitution of idealized nature for pre-scientifically intuitive nature. The substitution results in a more quantified and abstract object than what is pre-scientifically experienced. The transformations are the result of methodic demands so that we no longer are dealing with objects as directly experienced." Have you noticed often how abstract our terms are? We study consciousness or behavior. We deal with organisms and stimuli and responses. The specificities of concrete experience are gone. But if we return to the life world, we often find that the most basic encounter with objects and events is in terms of their expressiveness or physiognomy. So the most primordial experiential structure in the life world is the impression-expression structure, and the term physiognomy covers both sides of the structure. Long ago, the Hungarian but French-trained philosopher Georges Politzer argued that psychology should be a concrete science. And I think that we could use phenomenological philosophy to advance that idea. Merleau-Ponty picks up this Husserlian theme and vividly demonstrates the difference between the life world terms and the terms that science uses. It's a long quote, but it's so pertinent to my second point, I think most of it deserves to be quoted. Here's what Merleau-Ponty said. By way of guarding against myths, it is then desirable to point out everything that is made incomprehensible by empiricist constructions and all the basic phenomena they conceal. They hide from us in the first place the cultural world or human world, in which nevertheless almost our whole life is led. Now, for empiricism, cultural objects and faces owe their distinctive form, their magic power, to transference and projection of memory, so that only by accident has the human world any meaning. There is nothing in the appearance of a landscape, an object, or a body whereby it is predestined to look gay or sad, lively or dreary, elegant or coarse. Once more, seeking a definition of what we perceive through the physical and chemical properties of the stimuli which may act on our sensory apparatus, empiricism excludes from perception the anger or pain, which I nevertheless read in a face, the religion, whose essence I seize in some hesitation or reticence, the city, whose temper I recognize in the attitude of a policeman or the style of a public building. Perception, thus impoverished, becomes purely a matter of knowledge, a progressive noting down of qualities and of their most habitual distribution, and the perceiving subject approaches the world as the scientist approaches his experiments. If, on the other hand, we admit that all these projections, all these associations, all these transferences are based on some intrinsic characteristic of the object, the human world ceases to be a metaphor and becomes once more what it really is, the seat and, as it were, the homeland of our thoughts. The perceiving subject ceases to be an acosmic thinking subject, and action, feeling, and will remain to be explored as original ways of positing an object. Since an object looks attractive or repulsive before it looks black or blue, circular or square. End of quote. So that captures really the difference between life world and a scientific reconstruction of life world objects. In the above quotation, Merleau-Ponty is elaborating the insight first announced by Gestalt psychologists that expressiveness or physiognomy is a perceptual datum. We noted that Husserl stated that certain methodical idealities transform the life world givens, and Merleau-Ponty called the results of the scientific perspective empiricist constructions. And he argued that when such constructions replace the everyday terms of the life world, they conceal the human and cultural worlds. Merleau-Ponty wants to affirm that when one experiences the landscape as lively or an object as elegant, it is because the scene or the object have intrinsic characteristics that make such experiences possible. The world is richer than what we can comprehend cognitively, and Merleau-Ponty raises the question, also raised by Husserl, of whether feelings or desires cannot also be originary ways of positing objects. It seems that the life world offers more possibilities than the scientific perspective utilizes. We need to correct that discrepancy. The above tension between life world originality and scientific constructionism raises a question. Is it possible to remain more faithful to the original phenomena and still come up with an idea of science that has different advantages for gaining useful knowledge from those produced by the established modern scientific perspective? Husserl's insistence on the life world as the fundamental basis for all knowledge is a motivating force for seeking such a science. I think that the efforts of the Duquesne department had precisely such an idea in mind. I'd like to provide an example of how physiognomies can show themselves in data and how they can be understood. I was reading the data of one of my students who was working on the experience of jealousy. I came across several instances of clear physiognomic perceptions, and so I decided to analyze them, and I will give you one example. The context here is that the person describing the experience of jealousy helps out at the local high school, and he volunteers to do all sorts of odd jobs in order to keep the school functioning as efficiently as possible. The participant states that while doing some of these chores, a female student offered to assist him, and because she was helping, she had access to the teacher's lounge. In the lounge, there was another male teacher who, according to the participant, kept telling bad jokes and puns. On a specific occasion, the participant had to leave the lounge, and his female student helper remained there, listening to the male teacher. When he returned to the lounge, this is what he said. When I returned, I looked at my student in rapt attention to this bore and realized that she really had a crush on him. She was simply totally enamored of him, hanging on his every word. At first I thought it was cute, but then I thought, wait a minute, I'm being used. She's not coming in to help with the project. She's coming into the lounge to be close with this blowhard. I've been taken advantage of.
It's great.
So what did the participant see? Was he projecting into the situation? Was he jealously projecting feelings into the young woman because he wanted to be the object of such a desire? Was he transferring, associating, inferring? Or was he actually perceiving that she had a crush on the male teacher? Is it possible for a person to see that someone else has a crush on another person? If so, what is being perceived? Or how does such an awareness come to the observer? From a physiognomic perspective, yes, of course. When one asks the question, what is the object when there is a physiognomic perception or the perception of expressiveness, one is trying to ascertain the quality or nature of the given. For natural scientific psychology, the object of a perceptual act has to be palpable. That is, it has to be tangible, easily perceptible, which meant it had to have some kind of sensory content. But is the object of expressive perception sensorial? Sensory givens are included, of course, but are they the essence of expressiveness or of a physiognomic perception? Or are they subsidiary? Some phenomenological contributions. Now I'm going to go into the idea of a categorical object. It's a bit difficult. It's in the fifth logical investigation, but I tried to summarize it. I hope it comes through okay. If the subject matter of psychology has difficulty in meeting one of the criteria of the natural sciences, sensorial palpability, perhaps it should seek elsewhere for relevant criteria. Phenomenological philosophy, as the basis of a psychological science, can be helpful here because of certain discoveries concerning acts and their objects, as well as attitudes that are acceptable. What has to be considered is the notion of a categorical object, because I claim that physiognomic objects are categorical objects, which implies that irreal dimensions contribute to a perception of the object. The meaning of the categorical attitude and the categorical object is thoroughly discussed in the sixth investigation of Husserl's logical investigations. I can only cover the points related to irreal objects. The idea of intentionality includes the idea that acts of intentionality can find fulfillment when they land on a proper object. But of course, it is not at all guaranteed that intentional acts will be fulfilled. But Husserl was persistent in trying to find proper objects for intentional acts, even when it seemed unlikely. Remember, he called himself the true positivist, because even those objects without sensorial givenness, he said some object is being given. The question is particularly important when complex patterns of experience that include structured or articulated linguistic expressions are involved. Sokolowski, in elaborating Husserl's idea of categorical intuition, uses a simple example. The sentence, "The house is green." A question is then put to the sentence. Is there a given to all parts of that sentence? Sokolowski, paraphrasing Husserl, answers, "It seems clear that there's something in what we perceive that corresponds to the word house, and there's something that corresponds to the word green. But is there anything corresponding to the word is? In the empirical tradition, what is correlated with the word is due to psychological conscious activity and internal perceptions." But Husserl rejects that answer, and as Sokolowski states it, the being of the house is not a predicate of the house, but it's also not a predicate of the psychological activity that goes on when we see that the house is green. In general, Husserl argues against the notion that being is given in sense perception, whether the perception is internal or external. What then is specific to categorical intuition? The answer to that question will initially require some examples. The is in the sentence refers to the being of the object, not the object as such. To account for the being or the is, Husserl writes, "I can see color, but not being colored. I can feel smoothness, but not being smooth. I can hear a sound, but not that something is sounding. Being is nothing in the object, no part of it, no moment tendenting it, no quality or intensity of it, or no internal form whatsoever, no constitutive feature of it, however conceived. But being is also nothing attaching to an object, as it is no real internal feature. So also it is no real external feature, and therefore not in the real sense a feature at all. For it has nothing to do with the real forms of unity which bind objects. It's irreal. Being itself is an irreal." In general, two things happen in categorical objects. One, that one perceives the belongingness of a feature to an object. Two, a distinction is being drawn between the object and the presenting of the object. Sokolowski describes Husserl's distinction as follows. Not only do we have a thing and its feature presented to us, but we also have the presenting of the thing in its the presenting of the thing in its feature presented to us. Presenting is also presented, as well as that which is presented. It is this presenting that responds in what we experience to the word is when we state about something that it is such and such. Sokolowski points out that Husserl makes clear that it is not sufficient to simply experience or live through the perception of belongingness of a feature, but it must be made explicit, and that requires another act. Husserl distinguishes between straightforward and founded acts. A straightforward act of perception is a simple, uncomplicated act directed towards a simple object. For example, I perceive a house. Most of mainstream psychological research deals with this type of object. A founded act is a complex act based upon other acts and includes connections, conjunctions, disjunctions, or other types of relationships. For example, I perceive a stucco house painted 2 tones of green with the roof of red Spanish tiles. Husserl thus makes a distinction between sensuous and categorical perceptions. Even though categorical perceptions are based upon sensuous perceptions, the object that emerges is genuinely transformative of what was given in the straightforward perception that serves as a basis of the categorical act. Husserl writes, what we have are acts which, as we said, set up new objects, acts in which something appears as actual and self-given, which was not given and could not have been given as what it now appears to be in those foundational acts alone. On the other hand, the new objects are based on the older ones. They are related to what appears in the basic acts. So there are foundational acts and founded acts. And he's saying the categorical perception grasps both the founded acts and the founded acts and the foundational acts, but it's that complex categorical form that is the true object of the act of consciousness. Husserl also states that the objective correlates of categorical forms are not real moments. He characterizes sensuous objects as objects of the lowest possible order and categorical objects as objects of a higher order. Finally, Husserl adds an important note on the noetic aspect of founded acts. He writes, it is clear that the apprehension of a moment and of a part generally as a part, and in particular the apprehension of a sensuous feature as a feature, or of its sensual form as a form, points to acts which are all founded. These acts, in our case, of a relational kind. This means that the sphere of sensibility has been left and that of understanding entered. Let me try to summarize that briefly. I know it's a complex issue. Husserl demonstrates that intentional acts can find fulfillment with irreal objects. Thus, it is not necessary for objects to have sensoriality or similar data in order to function as phenomenological objects. When seeking the objects that could fulfill relational terms in linguistic expressions, Husserl found it necessary to distinguish between the presenting of an object and the object that was presented. The presenting relates to the being of the object, which can never be given perceptually, sensually. Recognizing presenting also requires categorical or founded acts that are founded on straightforward perceptual acts, but transcend them. And because they are new acts, they transform the previously straightforward sensuous object into a new complicated object that is now understood to be categorical. The categorical object requires that a dimension of non-sensuous understanding be part of the noetic act that apprehends it. Expressive phenomena as primary data. Next section. So, do the phenomenological contributions enumerated above help clarify the phenomenon of expressiveness or the experience of a physiognomic object? Let's turn to the key question. What is given when a physiognomic object or situation is perceived? The first thing that could be said is that the object could easily be categorized as categorical. In our example, the man said that he saw his female aide listening with rapt attention to his colleague, and that she was totally enamored of him, and that she was hanging on his every word. That is an articulated linguistic expression depicting what the person saw. Are these physiognomic features projections, associations, transferences? Or are they actually perceived as belonging to the female aide in that situation? If we limit ourselves to objective behavioral description, we might have gotten as data something like the aide and the professor were standing there talking to each other. The objective description, motivated by a natural scientific perspective, is cautious. And so it reflects a fear that saying that the aide had a crush on the colleague may have been a subjective intrusion on the part of the describer. It flows from the assumption that physiognomic characteristics are imposed upon neutral reality, rather than the view that such characteristics belong to the objects or situations themselves. Clearly, the objective description would have missed the essence of what actually took place. Psychology has to start its analyses from a perspective that is much closer to that of the life world. Ignoring physiognomy is basically ignoring psychology's database. But there's another complicating issue. Instead of a simple act being directed to an object, when categorical acts are enacted, Husserl noted that one could distinguish between the presenting of an object and the object that was presented. In other words, rather than a simple act-object relationship, which is usually the way intentionality is characterized, act, arrow, object, what we have here really is act-presenting object. Not just act-object, but object-presenting object, presenting. Because of the complication, the implication on the noetic side is that a purely sensory level of functioning is transcended, and a certain type of understanding is involved. So to understand our example correctly, perhaps we would have to say something like, the female aide's mode of presenting herself to the worker's colleague was to emotionally or romantically interact with him. And that mode of engagement, that mode of presenting, was judged to be happening by the worker. When I say judged, it's because another act is required that responds to the fulfillment of what was given, and since fulfilled, that is actually in person there, one can say it is seen. It's precisely because these situations involve modes of relating, as do most expressive phenomena, that we are dealing with states of affairs and therefore categorical perceptions. But categorical perceptions are not straightforward perceptions. In each case, it is always how the person acted that is the basis of physiognomic perceptions, and not the persons as such. Because it is the mode of presenting that supports the correct judgments about what is being seen, and presenting is always categorical, then that mode is not given sensorially. As Husserl has explicitly stated, being is absolutely imperceptible, and that the origin of the concept of being and of the remaining categories does not lie in the realm of sense perception. If one follows Husserl, it has to be acknowledged that certain kinds of psychological phenomena have to include more than real givens, even if real parts are also present. Again, within the reduction, we would speak of sensuous and non-sensuous aspects of the categorical object instead of real and near-real parts. This means that the understanding of perception has to be expanded, as Husserl does sometimes say, or we have to say that a spontaneous understanding is accomplished in some as yet undetermined way to bring about the awareness of the whole categorical object. Let's recall the last sentence of Merleau-Ponty's quotation. An object looks attractive or repulsive before it looks black or blue, circular or square. We apprehend these meanings in some spontaneous and non-elaborate way. How? I'm not sure. It requires further study, but I do think it's a point of departure to get there. Again, I have to raise the question, will these arguments and examples convince empiricists? I doubt it. There's a very special problem here, which is how to get intersubjective agreement on a non-sensorial given. Normally, empiricists will gather and present an empirical object and come to a consensus about what is given. But how does one do that with the near-real given? It's not a matter of logical argumentation. It's, as Husserl says, a matter of seeing. This seems to be another stumbling block to a unitary psychology, or perhaps it's the same one in a more complicated way. There seems to be an ontological shifting going on that seems to call for an analogous shift in psychological terminology, unless we have transcended psychology itself. But again, I haven't worked all that out yet either. I thought I double-spaced this, and I 1.5 did it. So it's taken longer to read. So I have a section on method, but if you want to stop and ask questions or want to leave, maybe you can, because I see I'm over an hour already. And I meant to talk only an hour, but I realized as I was reading, it's 1.5, not 2 double-spaced. So it took longer to read. So what's your pleasure? We can stop and have questions.
My suggestion would be to say that if there are some people who have to leave for a commitment, then to take this opportunity to do so. And I'm sure others would really like to hear the rest of the paper.
Well,
That's
so if anybody
suggestion.
has to leave, please feel free to.
There is an issue of absorptive capacity, though.
Yeah, I know.
Which you're very aware of, I know.
Yeah.
Because that's why you asked the question.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know how much of methodology people can absorb.
Yeah, but I want to hear about it.
You want to hear it. All right. You're the queen. That takes care of it. She wants to hear it.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that, but miscalculation. I'm not very computer savvy, so I missed that. All right, the question of method. When I was invited to come to teach at Duquesne by von Kamm, the pressing issue for him was the question of method. Since I was a methodologist, he wondered if I could come up with a method of data analysis that would be more sympathetic to the overall existential phenomenological approach of the department. I told him at the time that I knew too little about phenomenology, but that I would certainly try. He felt that the standard quantitative methods were not appropriate, and he kept mentioning that in Europe, researchers were using a phenomenological method. During the early years, I kept trying to find out what that method was that the Europeans were using, but no one could explain it to me. Von Kamm himself, not being a researcher, could not articulate it to me in a detailed and usable way. Finally, my sabbatical year arrived, and I spent it in Denmark because there were still members of the Copenhagen School of Phenomenology to speak to, and I used the occasion to visit every phenomenological psychologist in Western Europe to whom anyone could refer me. The Copenhagen School was not really Husserl-based, but they followed the phenomenal analyses of the color theorist Ewald Hering. One reason the term phenomenology gets so misunderstood is that it is applied to more than one tradition. One tradition began with Goethe, and it was continued by the Czech physiologist Purkinje, who was at Prague. And Hering also taught at Prague, and he was influenced by Purkinje. The other tradition, of course, was initiated by Brentano, who was the teacher of both Karl Stumpf and Husserl. And Stumpf is the key integrator here, because he also spent some years at Prague while Hering was there, and he was a colleague of Husserl's at Halle. It's also important to note that Stumpf moved on to the Psychological Institute at Berlin, and Kafka and Köhler earned their degrees under him.
Oh.
So some sense of phenomenology must have influenced those two gestaltists as well. In any case, Rubin's students whom I met in Copenhagen, there were 3 of them, followed more in the tradition of Goethe and Hering than that of Husserl. So I didn't learn any specific method from them, except the importance of description. I also visited living members of the Utrecht School, Buitendijk, Linsgoten, Langeveld, and I already knew Van den Berg. But they did not follow a specific method. They all described the phenomenal worlds of others, but did not say how they accomplished their tasks. All the other places I visited also neglected to mention anything about a method for phenomenological psychological investigations, including Louvain and the German centers I visited. The most I gathered from that year was that phenomenological psychology meant a theoretical critique of mainstream psychology, but a constructive alternative method for collecting and analyzing data based upon phenomenological insights and criteria simply did not exist. So when I returned home, I decided I would have to do something myself in order to respond to the challenge that von Kamm gave me. But I did at least gain confidence from the simple fact that no one else seemed to have developed a method. So if you have a clear field, it's okay. Try. I was aware that Husserl had developed a philosophical method, but as psychologists, we couldn't follow that method because we would end up doing philosophical analyses. But I thought that we could modify his method so that psychological analyses could be done. Husserl's method was rather straightforward. 1, you assume the posture of the transcendental phenomenological reduction. 2, you describe a phenomenon. 3, you determine its essence with the help of free imaginative variation, and then you describe the result. However, to have that method acceptable to scientists in general, and especially to empirical scientists, I imagine speaking to APA and all this, certain transformations had to take place, including a change in the order of the steps. I foresaw a problem with self-description. Within philosophical, scholarly context, descriptions of phenomena by philosophers themselves is perfectly acceptable. They do it all the time. But if I were to engage empirical psychologists, I could not describe the phenomenon myself because I was convinced that I would get a question right away that is theoretically possible to answer from a phenomenological perspective, but difficult for empiricists to accept, and it would become a major distraction and the method would never get off the ground. The question that I was sure I would get from my empirical colleagues is, how do I know that your description is not unconsciously in the service of your theory or viewpoint? If you write the description and then you analyze it, isn't the chance of prejudice highly likely? As I say, it's answerable, but it's long-winded, it's debatable, and you never get to step 2. As I said, it's answerable. So even before worrying about the assumption of the reduction, I had to worry about the problem of descriptions. I decided, therefore, that the first step had to be descriptions of phenomena by others from a natural attitude perspective. Ordinary persons in the everyday world know nothing about phenomenology, but they certainly can describe all sorts of experiences. Thus, such descriptions would become the raw data. This also would mean that the data would be life world based, and it would include physiognomic expressions and other features of everyday speaking. The second step requires the researcher to adopt the attitude of the phenomenological reduction, but of course not the transcendental reduction, but what Husserl called the phenomenological psychological reduction, and I prefer to call the scientific phenomenological reduction. Here the objects of experience are reduced, but not the acts, because we do want to make assertions about phenomena as experienced by humans. Merleau-Ponty says somewhere, I couldn't find it before this paper, but I know he says it, that the phenomenological attitude understands the natural attitude better than the natural attitude can understand itself. So the assumption of the phenomenological attitude is not a hindrance. So the modification in this step is that the researcher must assume the attitude of phenomenological reduction, but the participant does not. This also saves the researcher from having the headache of trying to explain what phenomenology is to every possible life world participant. And that could be a big headache. Finally, while imaginative variation is still used and we seek an essence of sorts, it is a psychological essence, or the most invariant meaning, to depict highly varied concrete meanings that appear in the raw data. It's like a measure of central tendency. But it's not a philosophical essence. Philosophers, as a rule, always seek findings that are universal, necessary, and absolute where possible. Scientific findings are more limited and more contextual because if they are brought to the highest eidetic level, the scientific interest is usually transcended. Our findings are closer to Weber's ideal types, but of course they are phenomenologically established. For example, if I told you that learning is the ability to do or experience something new, it would be true, but sort of psychologically empty. It is expressed at too high a level. That is the level at which philosophical essence are usually expressed. But if I said that a type of learning is one in which a person was able to clarify a situation that was rendered ambiguous because a false assumption applied to it did not enable the person to see the same situation in terms of different perspectives. Here there's more to chew on. What was the false assumption? How did the person clarify it? What is the nature of the ambiguity? Why did assuming different perspectives help? We need identical generalizations of the middle range, not those of the highest level. All scientists have to have a method, and so it was critical that the phenomenological psychological perspective develop a method, or else it would never take hold within a psychology that wanted to be scientific. By the way, I never said that the method that was developed on the basis of Husserl's philosophical method was the only method that a phenomenological approach could generate. It was simply easier, under the pressure I had, to adapt that method than to think through the whole issue of method from scratch. So far, I think I've provided some motivation for phenomenological philosophy to become the basis for a wholly different kind of science, one that would do justice to humans rather than to nature. I've pointed out how phenomenological philosophy, in my opinion, treats irreal phenomena and the irreal dimension of real phenomena in a better way. I also pointed out how its values could generate a method that did not favor quantification and that was more sympathetic to concrete descriptions. Moreover, the method meets the general criteria for science, even though it is qualitative, in that it can be critically evaluated and it can be replicated. My last points here. The phenomenological perspective is still very much a minority movement in psychology, especially when continental philosophical criteria are used. The term phenomenology is bandied about quite a bit in psychology and the social sciences in general, and very often it is used as a synonym for experiential. But I noted how Husserl commented that was only half right. Still, there is a presence there that I don't think will disappear, but I think it's important that we understand his contributions correctly, which means, as difficult as it is, that we really understand the philosophers correctly. In a certain sense, I see a parallel with the empirical tradition. Francis Bacon wrote the New Organon in 1620, and there followed almost 2.5 centuries of philosophical reflections on mental phenomena by Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Hartley, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and finally Alexander Bain, who died in 1903. But before he died, Sir Francis Galton in the 1860s and Wilhelm Wundt in the 1870s turned to phenomena in the world rather than contributing more personal reflections. They were scientific researchers rather than philosophers. Now, there's nothing wrong with philosophers. Without Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and others, there would be no phenomenology today. But as psychologists, we are scientific researchers rather than interpreters of texts. Although without interpretation of text, there would be no phenomenological psychology. The phenomenological philosophers have spent over 100 years now interpreting and clarifying phenomenological texts. But now it's up to us psychologists to draw from all that work and, armed with their insights, do phenomenological scientific work by investigating the phenomena of the human world. I have two conclusions. We have to develop human scientific psychology based on phenomenological philosophy, and that project is distinctly possible. Secondly, we have to acknowledge irreal phenomena and the irreal dimensions of real phenomena in order to be faithful to human presentive acts. Thank you for your attention. Any questions?
We can take a few questions.
Dick?
Okay, so you talked about the history that goes back a long ways when things were exciting and starting here. Do you see any development? Have things progressed? Are you optimistic or what? I mean, this is 50 years later. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a positive and maybe a hesitation. Positive, it's still here. I studied the phenomenological movement in psychology quite a bit, and it's an absolutely irrefutable historical fact that every place phenomenology started, it died. The Utrecht School is gone, the Copenhagen School is gone, the Stockholm School, where David Katz was, is gone. At Rhodes University in South Africa, it's no longer there. So, I don't know what it is about it, but I just think it fights the culture, is more countercultural than flowing with the culture, is one of the things. And governing bodies like APA, also are a restraining force on the development of phenomenological psychology. So, in that sense, that's a big positive. 50 years later, it didn't disappear. On the other hand, it seems that there's been some dilution of the project, I think. That is, the department is more postmodern and open to many types of alternative philosophical viewpoints. And so I think the concentration that we had in the early years on strictly existential phenomenology is not here with the same intensity and the same force, but it's still here. So those are the two differences that I see. And it's not easy to continue it. And I know that more than anybody else, that staying a phenomenologist and true to the vision of the original thinkers is not easy if you encounter all your colleagues all the time, trying to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. It gets tiresome. But you wake up the next morning, take a deep breath, and keep going.
Yeah, thank you. That was really wonderful. Very large span.
Yeah.
My question was maybe you expected a question like that when you said that as psychologists we're scientific researchers and not interpreters of text.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that we're not interpreters of text, I hear that as referring to philosophical texts,
Yeah.
right? So, but is there also not an interpretive element in the kind of scientific research we do? Because, often, we kind of man the barricades on interpretive research and phenomenological research. But isn't there a very strong interpretive element, even in your method? I think the method that you developed teaches people to really pay attention carefully to text, the text, which is the
to descriptions, which is
Yeah.
data-based, not philosophical text.
Right.
So
Yes.
that. No, I just was trying to differentiate between philosophers and what we will turn to the phenomena of the world. We will turn to the
Yeah.
experiencers who actually have those experiences and have them describe them, so that we can, analyze them and come up with some kind of understanding of the phenomena based on real data, not on reflections. So that's all I meant by that. But no, my method is not interpretive, it's descriptive. And that's we can go into that long argument if you
Yes.
like. But Husserl calls it a descriptive method, and I follow him, and it is descriptive. And to me, the difference between the two is very clear.
I hope this isn't too ignorant a question, but I just wanted to return to section 1 where you made a distinction between objectivity in the empirical tradition and objectivity in the phenomenological tradition. And you talked about how in the empirical tradition there's this attempt to remove subjectivity to obtain something like the view from nowhere and thereby see the noumena or the object in and of itself. And in the phenomenological tradition, you spoke of bracketing the ontological status of, say, the irreal and real objects and just simply experiencing them. In some sense, to me, that there's something structurally analogous there, in the sense that we're bracketing some assumptions and trying to see something more directly. So I was wondering if you could just clarify how phenomenological tradition doesn't fall into that same attempt to achieve a view from nowhere.
Attempt to achieve?
Attempt to achieve an objectivity without any kind of perspective.
Not without any perspective, but with a perspective that would lead to objectivity. Husserl acknowledges objectifying acts. But they are acts of a human subjectivity. Okay, so when you bracket the ontological, so I have presences, I simply do my descriptive work, analyzing, following the steps of the method, showing that if I follow my method, I say that this is what the subject says. Now I'm going to use imaginative variation, and I want to pull out the psychological dimensions. I'm only allowed to write meanings that appear to my consciousness, and I have to describe them very carefully. And of course, I use imaginative variation, so the first meaning that comes up may not be the one I keep. Merleau-Ponty describes it as there's a certain circumscribed indeterminacy. There's an indeterminacy. I don't know yet how I'm going to transform into a more phenomenological, psychological expression what the subject says. But it's a limited task. It's a circumscribed indeterminacy. And so I posit a kind of fulfillment, but I don't know yet what that fulfillment is. So I play around with imaginative expressions until I got it. This is it. That means that fulfillment satisfies precisely the signative intention that directed my search. And for Husserl, that's objectivity.
Thank you.
I have one more question. You have seen a lot of qualitative research over the many years. You've done it, you've seen it. And what is your sense, overlooking that field, what is it good for? What does it contribute? And I mean this in a very positive way. What is your sense that it allows psychology and other human beings to do with it?
Well, you could ask the question of the quantitative tradition too.
Yeah,
So,
I could, yeah. And they say, well, we build better technologies, we
And
make better
yeah.
advertisements.
And
so-
what we do is we come up with clarified meanings of concrete experiences. And if you clarify the meanings, presumably the person is better off because they can follow a clarified, directed meaning rather than, say, a more ambiguous meaning or an unclarified meaning, and that they're going along doing things not fully understanding what they're doing. I would say it's meaning. Phenomenology is concerned with the clarification of meanings primarily. And if you clarify meanings, presumably humans are better off, right?
So, So presumably phenomenology has something to do with what would be called in a very large spiritual tradition, enlightenment.
Yeah.
That people become clearer and live more in the light of what shows itself and the way it shows.
Yeah.
Yeah. Enlightenment.
Two or three more. Go ahead.
I was thinking about David Abram was here several months ago. And one of the things that he talked about was the natural world. And as you were talking, I was thinking, well, maybe phenomenology and human science hasn't gone far enough because of this respect in your work for the natural science attitude for the sciences. And so maybe there's a way in which one direction for phenomenology is to enter into the world where natural sciences have been, to be closer to the things themselves. Like he had described things like salmon swimming upstream and monarch butterflies, and he talked about that there's no internal clock. There's a closeness with the earth and with their own experience in some way. So I was thinking about your book and how you always made that distinction and kind of respected that area, but maybe we don't need to so much anymore.
Yeah, I was at that talk too. I thought it was a very good performance, but I didn't see it as clarifying. It was a good example of what Merleau-Ponty does, but there was not a theoretical clarification. He used Merleau-Ponty's concept and showed how it could apply to flocks of birds and sheep or whatever, fish. But I don't know, if you're interested in the human world, I don't know how that helps. There certainly could be a phenomenology of the animal world, and I would not be against that. So maybe you do something like what Abrams did to help clarify the animal world. But I try to stay with the human world all the time, and the natural attitude versus the phenomenological attitude are the two attitudes that I bounce between all the time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, philosophically, I can't argue anything, but I think he doesn't make that distinction, that he sees us as in one world as a more ecological system and not human and animal as separate in some way.
Well, yeah, that's also, from another perspective, that's true. But if you want to understand science, you do have to understand that they're in the natural attitude. And if you want to understand that better, you have to be in a different attitude to understand that attitude.
Right.
So that's why Husserl developed the phenomenological attitude as a way of understanding even natural attitude. So it's a further clarification, but if you're kind of in an ecological perspective, yeah, it's all one human world, and we belong to that world, and we interact with animals, what have you. But I think it's just two different perspectives. One being a philosophical clarification of how science functions, the other a description of how animals in their natural habitat really behave, as opposed to what the behaviorists did, putting them in the lab and restricting them, putting them in kinds of conditions. You don't really get a genuine animal world. It's a restricted world. Yeah.
Last one or two? Dr. Giorgi, thank you very much.